The desert stretched out around us like a vast, silent ocean, waves of sand rising and falling beneath a sky so wide it felt endless. Our small chartered plane hummed steadily as it cut through the dry air, its twin propellers stirring up currents that swept over the sunken channels below. I pressed my forehead against the window, watching the endless dunes roll by, each curve and shadow telling stories older than any history book. This was no ordinary field site. It was the heart of a land shaped by wind, sun, and secrets buried deep beneath the sand. Through the small window, I caught my first glimpse of where we'd be spending the next several weeks, a set of temporary research shelters nestled beside a low ridge, just visible as dark pinpricks in the ochre landscape. I adjusted my pack on my lap and leaned slightly toward the window. Beside me, Nyla was sketching a layout of the strat layers she expected to find. Though we'd been briefed, she preferred her own notes over whatever digital files we'd been handed. She was always more organized than I was. Across the aisle, Daniel snored softly, head tipped back against the seat. He'd been out since takeoff from Tamanrasset, somehow managing to sleep through the drone of the engines and the sudden shifts in altitude. I envied him. We were a small team, flown in under a special permit from the Algerian Ministry of Culture to assist with site assessment and preservation. The area we were heading into, southwestern Algeria, deep within the central Sahara, was said to contain some of the oldest petroglyphs and Proto-Berber architecture ever unearthed. Our task, as always, was part science, part bureaucracy: document, photograph, assess, and catalog anything of note before climate, looters, or politics made it vanish again. But this one felt different. Our field coordinator, Dr. Rafik, had worked the Sahara for decades. His message had been oddly terse when he invited me and my colleagues: bring minimal gear, prepare for off-grid conditions, no press involvement. That alone was strange. But it wasn't until he mentioned the rumors, oral traditions about something buried far older than any known settlement, that my interest sharpened. I'd read enough in fringe journals and obscure translated texts to know the kinds of stories he was referring to. Not the sort you find in textbooks, older myths, whispered ones. Tales of cursed ground, of ancient cities swallowed whole by the desert, and of voices carried on the wind that didn't belong to any man. One phrase kept appearing in the margins of what little literature there was: the sand that remembers. A place said to reject outsiders, where time collapsed and something buried waited to be disturbed. We touched down just before dusk. The plane's tires kicked up plumes of sand as it bounced twice on the makeshift airstrip and came to a lurching stop. The air that rushed in when the door opened was dense and metallic. Not just hot, there was a dryness that felt wrong, like it had stripped the moisture from everything it touched. The camp itself was minimal. A few semi-permanent tents, metal storage crates, a generator already straining in the heat. Dr. Rafik greeted us quickly, but with a distracted look in his eyes as though something else was occupying him entirely. He spoke mostly to Nyla, gave Daniel and me only a nod, then motioned toward the data hut. "We'd do orientation tomorrow," he said. "Tonight we should rest." That night I couldn't sleep. The heat inside the tent was smothering, even with the canvas flaps rolled up. I lay half awake for what felt like hours, listening to the wind hiss softly across the dunes. But somewhere in that half-conscious state, I dreamed. I was standing alone beneath a sky the color of burnt clay. The dunes around me had shifted into something unnatural, like ribs, curved and towering, forming a corridor of bone. And ahead of me, in the center of that dry canyon, stood a camel. But not like any I'd seen before. It was massive, nearly skeletal, its coat black and clinging to its frame like mummified hide. Its eyes were wrong, voids, deep and endless. It didn't move. Just stood and watched me with a patience that felt older than the desert itself. When I woke, my throat was dry and my hands were trembling. I told myself it was just heat sickness. Dehydration, maybe. First night nerves. The next morning, we began work. Rafik had pinpointed several zones for initial survey. Our team would focus on one particular stretch of rock outcroppings a few kilometers south of the base camp, where unusual erosion patterns had exposed what looked like sandstone carvings. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. But the further we walked along the slope, the more signs emerged: symmetrical grooves, strange indentations, and what looked like worn reliefs half buried in sun-caked sediment. Nyla crouched over one and began brushing it off with careful, practiced strokes. Daniel had climbed up a nearby ledge, photographing from above. Beneath a thin veil of grit, a pattern was beginning to emerge, interwoven curves forming a near-perfect spiral that didn't resemble decoration or language, but something somewhere between the two. My skin prickled. Further down the slope, we uncovered what looked like more fragments, weathered slabs, stacked or toppled in no recognizable formation. Some bore markings that might have once been pictographs, though erosion had nearly wiped them clean. Still, something about the placement felt intentional. It didn't look like a settlement. There were no clear structural foundations. It felt more like a threshold. A perimeter. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had spiked above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. We worked in shifts beneath shade canopies, logging GPS coordinates, sketching layouts, and bagging trace samples. I found myself glancing at the horizon more often than usual, watching for movement. There was no movement at all, not a single bird in sight. The desert was too still. That night, I reviewed the day's sketches by lantern light. Something was bothering me about the formation, the way the carvings didn't align with the slope, the erosion patterns inconsistent with the age of the stone. It was as if something had been placed here long after the surrounding geology had settled. Like it had been brought in. Inserted. The wind picked up again around midnight. At first, it was just a dry rustle through the rocks. Then it grew into a constant rush, sand pattering softly against the tent's outer walls. I stepped outside for air. The dunes had vanished behind a veil of fine dust, suspended and glowing in the moonlight. The wind didn't roar, it hissed. And somewhere behind it, I thought I heard something else. Not voices. Not language. Just rhythm. Like a beat, low and buried, as if the desert itself was remembering something. Daniel stepped out of his tent and looked at me, then toward the horizon. The weather looked like it was shifting. I nodded, but it didn't feel like weather. The fog didn't move like a storm front. It clung too close to the ground, swirling in slow, circular patterns, as if searching for a path forward. By morning, visibility had dropped. The generator was starting to fail. And from across the flat, near the perimeter markers we'd set the day before, we found something new, something the storm had uncovered. The desert awoke with a restless energy the morning after we found the bones. The sun rose low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the shifting dunes. Our survey area lay just beyond a deep sunken channel, its dry bed cracked and broken like ancient pottery. Nyla and Daniel moved carefully over the uneven ground, cataloging the fragments of bone we'd uncovered, their pale surfaces glinting harshly in the sunlight. As we worked, the wind began to change. What had been a steady, gentle breeze from dawn shifted subtly, carrying a gritty bite that scratched at the backs of our necks. The air grew thicker, and the horizon blurred into a hazy mirage of swirling sand. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, the first notes of a sandstorm began to whisper. We hastened our work, urgency driving each movement. The cracked scroll we'd found inside a nearby carved alcove felt heavier in my pack than it should have, as if the desert itself resisted our discovery. Nyla carefully unrolled it in the shade, the fragile parchment brittle but etched with looping, ancient script. Though I couldn't read the language, the twisting symbols seemed to pulse with a strange vitality, knowledge long buried, now stirring. The scrolls spoke of a lost library, a repository of wisdom once guarded by a vanished civilization, knowledge that might hold the key to surviving what lurked beneath the sands. Legends told of a powerful entity bound beneath the desert, a djinn trapped by rites older than memory, its restless spirit seeking freedom and vengeance. Suddenly, the sandstorm broke. A wall of dust and grit roared in from the east, swallowing the sun and swallowing the sky. The air turned electric, and visibility dropped to mere feet as the wind shredded at our clothes and sliced into exposed skin. We scrambled toward the narrow crevice between two ridges, where the land dipped low enough to offer some shield. The storm was alive. Amid the chaos, I caught movement. Something darted between the shifting waves of sand, lanky, malformed, and grotesque. It moved with an unnatural rhythm, limbs twisting like a marionette's strings pulled by a cruel puppeteer. Its face was split, half missing, revealing hollow sockets that stared into nothingness. The creature was a Nasnas, conjured or commanded by the Djinn's dark will. The dust ripped at my eyes as the creature lunged through the storm's veil, a fleeting, monstrous silhouette snarling and jerking erratically. I shouted a warning, but the wind swallowed my voice. Daniel and Nyla vanished from sight as I pressed against the rough stone wall, heart hammering, lungs burning. When the storm finally passed, an uneasy calm settled. We regrouped, shaking off grit and fear. Daniel rubbed at a shallow scratch across his cheek, his eyes wide but determined. Later that night, I awoke gasping beneath a sky veiled with thin clouds. The desert was eerily quiet, save for the steady hiss of shifting sands. Near the edge of the campfire's glow, a tall shadow froze my breath, a black camel. Its mummified form was unnatural, ribs stark beneath the tight, dark hide, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly fire. It stood still, watching with a patience older than time, until a gust scattered the embers and it vanished as silently as it had appeared. The vision clung to my mind, a warning whispered on the wind. Over the next days, we delved deeper into the secrets hidden beneath the dunes. Sunken channels led to fractured stone chambers and weathered alcoves where faded petroglyphs hinted at rituals lost to time. The deeper we ventured, the more the desert seemed to resist, the air heavy with unseen eyes and unspoken threats. One evening, as the sun dipped below a horizon blurring with heat, I noticed strange patterns in the sand, tracks not made by any animal I knew. Jagged, erratic marks that twisted and spiraled, leading toward the ruins where the scroll had hinted at the lost library. A place rumored to hold the wisdom to bind or banish the Djinn. That night the camp trembled with whispered movements beyond the firelight. I caught glimpses of unnatural shapes shifting at the edges of vision, tall, warped forms lurking just beyond reach, their eerie clicking and rasping filling the night air. The desert's shadows seemed alive, stalking us with a slow, malevolent patience. When the Nasnas struck, it was sudden and violent, a whirlwind of clawed limbs and jerking movements under the moonlight. We scattered, breaths ragged, hearts pounding as we fought to regroup. Daniel disappeared into the darkness for a terrifying moment, and I was forced to chase the howling wind to find him, dragging him back from unseen terrors. By dawn, the desert had claimed its toll. Our bodies ached, our minds frayed by fear and sleeplessness. But somewhere in that exhaustion, a fierce resolve took root. The desert's ancient curse would not claim us without a fight. The scroll's cryptic wisdom whispered in my mind, promising that the desert's secret could be unbound. But to do so, we'd have to confront the Djinn itself, and survive the creatures born of its wrath. By mid-morning the storm had burned itself out, but it left behind a quiet that felt unnatural. The desert, normally noisy with wind or shifting sands, had fallen into a stunned kind of stillness. Even the distant hum of insects had gone quiet. Nyla said something about barometric pressure shifts, but it felt heavier than that, like something had been disturbed that wasn't meant to be. We moved slowly that day, following a shallow ravine that split south from the eroded ridge. The sand was looser here, clinging to our boots in a way that made each step feel weighted. Dr. Rafik had flagged the area as a low-priority site, just a scatter of odd magnetic readings from a decades-old flyover. But Nyla's instruments had picked up anomalies in the subsurface layering the night before, and now that the sand had shifted, she insisted we take another look. I lagged behind as they climbed the gentle slope ahead. The landscape was flattening out into a wide, shallow basin, sunken, wind-smoothed, and unremarkable at a glance. But as I reached the top, I saw why Nyla had stopped. A depression had opened up, maybe 20 meters across. Not a sinkhole, not exactly, but a collapse of some kind. The sand had slumped into a wide bowl, exposing long-buried stone beneath it. Dark slabs of cut rock jutted through the sand at angles that weren't natural. The geometry was too clean, the placement too deliberate. Daniel was already down in the basin, brushing at one of the larger stones. "These edges aren't eroded," he said, voice muffled behind his mask. "Some of this looks preserved." I crouched beside him and ran a gloved hand over the exposed surface. The stone was black, almost oily, and cold to the touch despite the heat. Across its face ran shallow carvings, rows of symbols, unlike any script I recognized. They weren't decorative. Each line had weight, purpose. They weren't Berber, weren't Phoenician, weren't anything I'd seen in the archive. But I felt something in them. A rhythm. Nyla joined us, squinting at the markings. "These aren't petroglyphs," she murmured. "They're inscriptions." We cleared more of the basin until the shape came into view, an entrance. Half buried beneath the sand, a stone archway framed in interlocking blocks. Not a tomb, not a chamber. A library. Or what was left of one. It took the better part of 2 hours to secure the rigging and descend through the breach. The sand inside had settled unevenly, forming steps that dropped deeper into the earth. We went in with headlamps and backups, none of us speaking much. Even Daniel was quiet now. The air inside was stale, but breathable, cooler than outside, carrying a scent like dusted parchment and iron. The first chamber was massive. A domed room, its ceiling blackened from centuries of heat and ash. Carved shelves lined the walls, most empty or collapsed. But here and there we found fragments, tablets etched in long-dead languages, rolls of brittle parchment sealed in copper tubes, shattered tiles painted with constellations. Nyla was vibrating with academic glee. Daniel photographed every square inch. I stood in the center, staring at the floor. Inlaid into the stone was a map, not a region, but a system. Concentric circles, radiating outward from a central symbol. It reminded me of an irrigation diagram, or a celestial chart. Or maybe a warning. Nyla knelt at the outer edge of it, and traced a finger along one of the rings. "This is directional," she said. "Whatever this place was, it was designed to point towards something. A center." We moved deeper. There were more chambers, more carvings, more clues. Ancient diagrams describing wind patterns, burial rites, constellations shifting over time. And beneath them all, recurring motifs, storms, bones, half-men who walked only in moonlight. One passage showed a man's shadow splitting away from his body and taking on a life of its own. I stopped at a wall etched with a series of panels. In the flicker of my light, it seemed to tell a story. A desert tribe, joyful, thriving, dancing around fire. Then, a storm, a darkness descending from above. Then came the erasure. Figures with twisted limbs, mouths opening into other mouths. Fire consuming cities. A final panel showed the tribe burying something, encasing it in stone and setting symbols around it like teeth in a trap. Nyla stood beside me, silent. "It wasn't just a settlement," she said. "It was a prison." We turned back an hour later, loaded down with samples and photos, our minds racing. We didn't speak much that night over dinner, though Nyla tried. Her voice cracked once, and she looked away. Daniel drank more than usual, his hands jittering. I cleaned my tools twice just to keep busy. After lights out, I couldn't sleep again. The heat had broken, but the air was too still. Too thick. My ears rang in the silence. Somewhere in that half-sleep, I saw the black camel again. This time I was in the sunken basin, the collapsed library yawning open behind me. The camel stood just beyond the stone archway, half-shadowed, half-illuminated by a blood-orange moon. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, and I saw something moving behind its ribcage. A shifting, churning shape, like smoke or flies. Then it stepped forward, and I woke, gasping, the tent wall bowing inward as if from a sudden gust. But there was no wind. The next day was worse. One of our canopy stakes had been torn free in the night. Our supplies were scattered. Nyla swore she'd secured everything. We chalked it up to weather. We returned to the basin, but something had changed. The entrance to the buried library was gone. Not buried, sealed. As if the sand had crept back deliberately, layer by layer, forming a perfect dome of smooth wind-blown powder. No sign of our work remained. Daniel stood staring at it, mouth slightly open. "We spent hours here," he said. "There were tracks. Here. Where the hell did it all go?" Nyla said nothing. She turned and walked back to camp, eyes wide and unblinking. That afternoon, I found a scrap in my notebook that I didn't remember writing. A diagram, crudely sketched, showing concentric circles and a crude figure in the center, arms outstretched. Beneath it, in handwriting that didn't feel like mine, were the words, "It waits. It remembers. It hears." I didn't show anyone. The wind came back that night. This time it didn't carry sand, it carried scent. Not rot, not decay, but something metallic and sharp. Like ozone before a storm. I stepped out of the tent and scanned the flat. And there, on the horizon, I saw it. A figure, standing still just at the edge of the dune. Bent. Wrong. Its arms too long, one leg twisted backward. It didn't move. It didn't need to. I went back inside. I didn't sleep. The desert sun pressed down with a merciless weight, and every breath I drew tasted like dry rust. We moved cautiously toward the basin that the ancient map had promised, a place older than memory, scarred by centuries of secrets. The sand beneath my boots shifted unevenly, as if the earth itself was restless. The wind carried no relief today, only the faintest hint of sulfur and ozone, a warning whispered through the shimmering heat. Nyla and Daniel followed close, their movements precise but tense. The landscape around us was a stark gallery of death and endurance. Scattered bones, half swallowed by sand, lay bleached white under the relentless sun. Twisted remnants of trees, blackened and curled, clung desperately to life in tiny patches of cracked soil. Shadows deepened beneath jagged outcrops, hiding dangers we could not yet see. Then the Nasnas came. From the jagged rocks and hidden caves, they emerged like nightmares given flesh, half-formed creatures with limbs bent at impossible angles, faces a grotesque fusion of man and beast. Their movements were erratic yet terrifyingly swift, a flicker in the corner of my vision before they lunged. One charged toward me, its clawed hand scraping the air just inches from my face. My heart slammed in my chest as I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the slash. Daniel's shout echoed behind me, and I saw him grappling with another Nasnas, his face pale beneath the dust mask. Nyla fired her flare pistol into the air, the bright burst startling the creatures and forcing them to retreat momentarily. The desert echoed with guttural snarls and the sharp crack of flare shots, but the Nasnas did not flee. Instead, they vanished into the shadows, their eyes gleaming with savage intent. I pressed a hand to the shallow cut along my forearm, feeling the sting of dirt and blood. There was no time for pain. The desert was closing in. As the adrenaline surged, the black camel from my dreams appeared again, standing silently on a distant dune, its skeletal form etched starkly against the shimmering heat haze. Its eyes glowed like coals, watching me with a patience that burrowed beneath my skin. The camel was not flesh and blood, it was a harbinger, a shadow cast by the Djinn itself. The ground trembled beneath my feet, a low rumble rising from the earth like the breath of a sleeping giant. I turned to see a massive disturbance. The sand erupted in a writhing column, and the legendary sandworm burst forth. Its segmented body, glistening with obsidian plates, tore through the dunes with terrifying power. The air vibrated with its roar, a sound like thunder rolling across the empty wastes. Daniel grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a narrow canyon that cut a jagged path through the rocks. The sandworm's colossal bulk could not follow into the tight space, but its fury sent blasts of sand and dust that stung like needles. We scrambled over cracked stones, coughing and shielding our eyes. Nyla's voice was urgent, clipped with panic. "We need to finish the ritual before it regains strength." The inscriptions from the buried library burned in my mind, ancient words, rituals meant to bind and banish. But out here, with the Djinn's power twisting the very desert around us, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred. The Djinn was no mere spirit, it was a force that consumed, controlled, and corrupted. In the flickering light of our headlamps, shadows danced and twisted into false shapes. At times, the sand itself seemed to rise and curl like smoke, forming grotesque visages that dissolved when I blinked. The Djinn toyed with us, bending time and space until minutes stretched into agonizing hours. Daniel's breath came ragged. His leg was bleeding from a deep gash inflicted during the earlier skirmish with the Nasnas. I tore strips from my shirt to bind the wound, hands shaking as the Djinn's voice echoed in my ears, a whisper promising power, freedom, release. I fought to keep my mind tethered to the here and now. The black camel reappeared closer now, striding effortlessly over the dunes, always watching. Its presence was a pulse in the air, an unrelenting reminder of the price we might pay. The Djinn's form began to materialize at the canyon's edge, an ever-shifting silhouette woven from sand, smoke, and flame. Its glowing eyes pierced the darkness like twin stars, and the air around it crackled with raw energy. The ground beneath our feet seemed to warp, rocks bending and twisting as if alive. It reached out with hands that dissolved into swirling sand, sending a wave of searing heat toward us. We dodged behind rock formations, the air trembling with the force of the attack. Nyla chanted words from the scrolls, her voice steady despite the chaos. Daniel and I held off the Nasnas, their howls rising in a cacophony of rage and despair. The sandworm, sensing its master's weakening hold, launched one last furious assault. Its massive jaws snapped inches from my arm as I scrambled away, heart pounding. The earth shook with each strike, dust choking the air. We fought like cornered animals, desperation sharpening every movement. Finally, with a cry that tore through the night, I completed the ritual. The scrolls burned in a sudden flare of blue-white flame, and the Djinn's form shattered into a storm of dust and shadow. The Nasnas dissolved into nothingness, and the sandworm retreated beneath the earth's crust. The desert fell silent. Exhausted, we sank to the ground, the weight of what we had faced settling heavily on our chests. Above us, the stars blinked cold and distant, indifferent to the battles waged beneath their gaze. The black camel was gone, leaving only the whisper of sand on the wind. For a moment, there was peace. But I knew better. The desert remembers. And it waits. After the Nasnas collapsed, its twisted limbs twitching in the firelight like something still deciding whether it was alive or not, we remained where we were. The sand around the ritual stones was dark with soot, and the strange salt-like lines Nyla had drawn still glowed faintly, tracing forgotten sigils into the ground. The air never fully settled. Even after the creature went still, something beneath the earth kept moving. The vibration never truly stopped, it simply quieted, as if waiting. We kept the fire burning through the night. Daniel made rounds along the outer stones with what was left of our paraffin, reinforcing the boundary line with desperate care. Nyla had stopped speaking altogether, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion, her hands trembling whenever she reached for her pack. By the time the horizon began to shift from black to gray, the tremor in the sand began to vibrate again. Not a quake, not wind, more like something exhaling beneath us. At first, I thought it might be a storm system. But there were no clouds. No warning gusts or pressure drop. Just a sudden, unnatural stillness, as if the whole desert was holding its breath. And then the fire twisted. It didn't just lean, it jerked sideways as if pulled by an unseen force. I rose slowly, watching the flames snake toward the eastern ridge, licking the air like they were pointing at something. Nyla rose a few seconds later, and I could feel her eyes on me without turning. We weren't alone anymore. Something was coming. And it was worse than the nastiness. The wind didn't rise so much as thicken. The air changed texture, grainy, charged, filled with that metallic edge we'd started to associate with the presence of the Djinn. It stung the throat, bit at the nose like ozone before lightning, but drier, sharper, like the chemical warning before a cave-in. Daniel stepped beside me, clutching the flare gun. Before I could answer, the sand beyond the circle of stones cracked open. It didn't explode or erupt. It peeled. A long seam split down the ridge, and from within, a churning shape began to rise. Not fast, not violent, just rising, deliberate and slow, confident. A shifting form of black and copper, lightless at its center, ringed in a heat shimmer so intense it made the dunes behind it warp and buckle like film under a magnifying glass. We backed away from the circle instinctively. The thing that stepped forward was not the Djinn's true form. I was sure of that. This was a mask, a shell designed to hurt our minds just enough to keep us afraid. Its legs were malformed, knee joints reversed, weight distributed as if it didn't rely on gravity. A crooked crown of charred bone protruded from its head, and its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a veil of chain-like strands that whispered against each other as it moved. The stones around the ritual site began to vibrate, and the lines Nyla had drawn pulsed once in warning, then dimmed. Whatever was keeping it out had started to fail. I grabbed my pack, knowing exactly what I needed to find. Buried at the bottom, beneath every notebook, ration, and sample vial, was the torn parchment I'd taken from the sealed library. I had kept it from Nyla and Daniel. Something about it felt personal, dangerous even, but now, in the face of this thing, it was all I had. I unrolled it with shaking hands. The ink was faint but intact, interlocking symbols that mirrored the ones we'd seen carved into the basin walls. A diagram of movement or command. A binding script, incomplete but still potent. The Djinn paused just beyond the outer ring of our camp. It didn't move forward. It didn't need to. It lifted one arm and swept it slowly through the air, and with that motion, the sand beneath us began to spiral outward, concentric circles uncoiling like a draining whirlpool. Daniel stepped in front of me, aiming the flare gun. The Djinn didn't flinch. It just looked at him, or through him, and Daniel began to stagger. He dropped the flare gun and fell to one knee, choking as though something was pressing down on his chest. Nyla screamed his name, but I was already moving. I dove across the sand, catching the flare gun before it rolled into the shifting spiral. Without aiming, I turned and fired at the base of the creature's feet. The flare struck the sand and erupted in a white-hot bloom, but the Djinn didn't burn. It didn't even move. It absorbed the heat as if feeding on it, the flames dimming as they coiled up its frame and vanished into its hollow chest. It stepped forward. Nyla scrambled back toward the ritual stones, pulling a bundle from her belt, fragments of powdered obsidian mixed with salts. She began hurling handfuls at the circle, trying to redraw the failing glyphs. I knelt beside Daniel, pulling him away from the front line. His face was pale, mouth moving but no sound coming out. He wasn't choking, he was mouthing something repeatedly. It waits. It remembers. It hears. I glanced down at the torn parchment. One of the glyphs had started to glow faintly along its edge. That was my only chance. I knelt at the center of the ritual site, slamming the parchment to the sand and tracing the missing sigils with a blackened shard of charcoal from the fire. The symbols weren't just pictures, they were motions. I didn't write them so much as complete them, moving my arm in mirrored arcs, circling, closing gaps. The Djinn shrieked. It wasn't a roar. It was a scraping, teeth-on-metal shriek that buckled the air and made every nerve in my body vibrate in protest. Daniel covered his ears. Nyla collapsed to her knees. But I kept going. The final sigil wasn't written. It had to be spoken. I didn't know the language, not truly, but the shapes burned into my eyes had begun to align in my mind like a long-forgotten song. I spoke the word, or something close to it, and slammed my hand against the center of the parchment. The sand exploded outward. Not up out. In a radius. A shockwave tore through the circle, and the Djinn reeled. For the first time, it stumbled, one arm flailing back as if struck by something unexpected. Its body began to split. Thin seams appeared along its torso and limbs, like a statue cracking from within. Light poured out, not gold, not fire, but something whiter than white. A cold, erasing light bled from the cracks as the Djinn shrieked again, more animal than divine. It reached toward me, limbs twitching, unraveling at the edges. I ducked to the side as it lunged, its claws sweeping just above my shoulder and carving a trench into the stone behind me. The fire ring reignited, without fuel, without touch, and formed a burning circle around the parchment. Flames rose 10 feet into the air. The Djinn staggered. Daniel crawled forward, dragging a sack of ammonium salts he'd recovered from our scattered supplies. He flung them into the flames, and the fire shifted color, sickly blue and violent green, the heat sucking the moisture from the air instantly. The Djinn fell to its knees just beyond the ring. It didn't scream now. It hummed, a deep, terrible vibration that rattled the fillings in my teeth and made the stones themselves shake beneath us. And then it began to collapse. Not like a body. Like a structure. Piece by piece, its limbs fractured and folded inward, the light consuming each segment. Its head fell back, veil burning away in streaks of black smoke. For a moment, its true face flashed beneath, a face not shaped for human understanding. Something with too many eyes. And behind them, a hatred that reached past time. Its torso fell forward, and split open like a broken shell. What was left inside wasn't flesh. It was a storm. A void packed with centuries of suffering, rage, and heat too old to belong to this earth. That final burst of energy slammed outward in a circle, flattening every tent, snuffing the fire, and throwing me hard into the stones. I hit the ground and didn't move. When I opened my eyes, the sky above me was clear. Pale morning light stretched across the basin. But there was no trace of the Djinn. Just a scorched crater where the parchment had burned, ringed in black glass and twisted metal. Daniel sat nearby, leaning forward, arms draped over his knees. His clothes were singed, his hair matted, but he was breathing. Nyla stood at the basin's edge, staring toward the dunes. The sun had just crested the horizon, and in its light, the sand looked quiet again. Almost normal. But nothing about what we'd survived would ever feel normal again. The desert didn't return to quiet. It held its breath, taut and electric, as if waiting for something to stir beneath the sun-baked earth. The usual hum of wind over sand was gone, replaced by a silence so thick it pressed in on my ears, like the world itself was listening, and not ready to speak. I sat heavily on a smooth sandstone slab just beyond the scorched crater where the Djinn had shattered and disappeared. The ground around me was cracked and blackened, glistening faintly where the fire's heat had fused the sand into glass. The strange salt lines Nyla had drawn hours ago were fading, almost melting back into the earth, as if the desert refused to hold them. The air was still, but beneath that stillness, I could feel a vibration, a faint, steady resonance, like a heartbeat echoing through the ground. My limbs ached with the residual shock of the fight. Every muscle screamed from tension and exertion, but exhaustion was a distant second to the gnawing dread inside me. The morning sun warmed my face with pale light, but it couldn't burn away the shadow crawling under my skin. Daniel sat nearby, motionless, staring out at the dunes with eyes far away and heavy lids. Nyla was perched cross-legged on the sand, her hands resting on her knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where sand met sky in an unbroken, shimmering line. A restless wind stirred at last, trailing dust in lazy spirals around us. Somewhere far off, a coyote's mournful call echoed, distant and lonely, as if the wild knew the desert had changed. The land felt fractured, like the brittle bones of an ancient creature exposed and vulnerable. My mind drifted back to the buried library, the labyrinth beneath the dunes that had swallowed us whole in shadow. Its chambers, etched with forgotten languages and celestial diagrams, were a testament to desperation. The tribe who built it had been desperate to imprison what they could barely understand. The walls told stories not just of survival, but of ritual and sacrifice, of storms that burned with fire and creatures born of bone and shadow. The symbols weren't simply decoration or prayer, they were functions, precise and dangerous. Diagrams, yes, but also locks. Nyla's voice broke the heavy silence. The glyphs we uncovered. They weren't just words or seals. They were a guide, directions and warnings woven together in code. She glanced at me, her eyes bright beneath the haze of exhaustion and dust. This place was designed to point to something far older and darker. The basin isn't just a prison, it's a marker. A signal. Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice low and raw. Whatever that thing was. It's part of something bigger. A cycle, maybe? Or a prison that's never truly closed. I closed my eyes and tried to calm the chaotic rush of images in my mind. The black camel from my dream flickered before me, skeletal, hollow-eyed, standing sentinel on the horizon. It wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just a warning either. The camel had been present in the old relief carvings in the library, always nearby when something was being bound or buried. It was never the cause, never the executioner. It was the witness. The messenger. The one left behind to remember the story when everything else had burned. Around us, the wind shifted again. This time, it carried a whisper, almost inaudible, a thread of sound woven from the rustle of dry grasses, the soft clatter of stones tumbling, and something deeper, a rhythm, an ancient cadence older than any voice I'd heard before. The desert was speaking. It was remembering the weight of time and loss. Nyla stood slowly and began gathering her scattered notebooks, her fingers trembling slightly. Daniel rose beside her, his hands twitching as he packed the last of our gear. The three of us moved in slow, deliberate silence, each wrapped in our own thoughts and fears. As I watched the dunes roll endlessly beyond the camp, the rising sun caught on something unexpected, a shimmer of movement, a ripple in the heat haze. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then the shape resolved, a solitary figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line where the desert met sparse scrub. The figure didn't move but seemed to radiate a strange energy. Its outline was vague, distorted, flickering as if barely tethered to this world. And beneath that wavering form, the unmistakable shadow of the black camel stretched long and thin across the sand, poised and watchful. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, heart pounding against the cage of my ribs. Whatever we'd faced, whatever we'd survived, it wasn't gone. Not really. The past few days flashed back in fragments, Nyla's whispered translations, the sealed library's cryptic warnings, Daniel's fearful gaze as the Djinn approached. The circle of stones, the ritual we'd barely understood until the final moments, and the shattering light that had rent the creature apart. But as I stood there, looking out at that flickering silhouette, it became clear, the fight hadn't ended. It had only paused. Like a storm gathering beyond the horizon, waiting for its moment to break loose once more. Nyla's voice came beside me, low and steady despite the exhaustion. There are things buried deep in this desert, things older than cities, older than men. Guardians, watchers. And curses that echo across time. Daniel nodded slowly. We only scratched the surface. The past is buried here in the sand, but it's alive. It's angry. We knew then that we couldn't leave, not yet. The desert held secrets we were only beginning to understand, and it wasn't done with us. That afternoon, we returned to the crater to collect what remained of our equipment and notes. The glassy black sand still glowed faintly where the ritual had burned hottest, but the salt lines Nyla had traced were almost completely gone. The desert was swallowing its own story again. We gathered around the fading fire pit, tracing our fingers over the scorched earth, each lost in thought. The desert's ancient pressure still vibrated beneath us, a subtle resonance that seemed to sync with our racing hearts. I thought back to the diagrams in the library, celestial charts overlapping with irrigation maps, symbols intertwining like veins of light beneath the earth. They hinted at a knowledge lost to time but preserved in coded patterns, warnings meant to be rediscovered by those who dared to listen. Nyla broke the silence once more, her voice barely above a whisper. We've disturbed something that was meant to be forgotten. And now it remembers us. The sky deepened to a brilliant azure as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the dunes. The heat of the day faded into a cool, biting chill. Night was coming, the time when the desert's secrets stirred most fiercely. We camped in uneasy silence, the memory of the Djinn's screech still raw in our ears. Sleep was a fragile luxury. My mind replayed every moment, every flash of light, every shadow that had danced just out of reach. As darkness wrapped around us like a cloak, I caught a glimpse of movement beyond the circle of stones, a pair of glowing eyes, watching, waiting. The black camel's silhouette lingered at the edge of my vision, a silent sentinel in the night. The desert had not finished with us. It never would. And somewhere, beneath the shifting sands, the ancient storm stirred once more.